The collapse of the Western Roman Empire is often dated to 476 AD, when Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic general who declared himself king of Italy. Yet Rome, both as an idea and as a political force, did not simply vanish in that year. The Eastern Roman Empire, better known to modern historians as the Byzantine Empire, remained powerful, wealthy, and determined to restore its influence over the lost western provinces. Justinian I, one of the most ambitious emperors of the East, launched a series of wars known as the Gothic Wars in Italy, attempting to reclaim the heartland of the old empire from the Ostrogoths who had taken control. It was in this long and bloody conflict that the Battle of Volturnus in 554 AD became the final decisive clash, a moment where Rome's legacy fought for survival against the encroaching forces of new barbarian kingdoms. By the middle of the 6th century, Italy had been devastated by nearly 2 decades of war between the Byzantines and the Ostrogoths. Cities had been besieged, aqueducts destroyed, fields abandoned, and populations scattered. Justinian's brilliant general Belisarius had made great progress early on, capturing Rome and much of Italy, but the struggle dragged on as the Ostrogoths regrouped under determined kings like Totila. Totila had nearly reversed the Byzantine advances, retaking Rome more than once, and by the early 550s the war had reached a stalemate that drained both sides. Then, in 552 AD, the imperial court in Constantinople sent another general, Narses, to command in Italy. Though elderly and not a traditional soldier, Narses proved a cunning strategist, assembling a diverse army of Byzantines, Lombards, Heruli, and other allies. At the Battle of Tagenae in 552, Totila was killed and the Ostrogoths decisively defeated, leaving their remnants leaderless. Yet Italy was not safe. The Frankish kingdom, stretching across much of modern-day France and Germany, saw opportunity in Italy's weakness. The Franks had grown into the most powerful barbarian successor state in the West, and their kings sought expansion into the rich lands of the peninsula. In 553 and 554 AD, Frankish and Alemanni warbands poured over the Alps, seeking plunder and conquest. Unlike the Ostrogoths, who had sought to preserve Roman institutions and rule Italy as their own kingdom, the Franks were less interested in governance and more in raw conquest. They ravaged towns, destroyed crops, and clashed with the scattered Byzantine garrisons. For the exhausted Italians, this was a new invasion in a land already shattered by decades of conflict. Narses, despite his age, quickly realized that the Frankish threat had to be destroyed if Italy was to remain under imperial control. He rallied his forces, gathering troops from Ravenna, Rome, and southern Italy, and prepared to march north to confront the invaders. The Franks, numbering tens of thousands, had split into 2 main groups, some under Butulinus and others under Lutherus. They advanced deep into the peninsula, reaching as far as Campania in southern Italy. It was near the river Volturnus that the decisive encounter would take place, in the summer of 554 AD. The Byzantine army at this time was unlike the legions of classical Rome. Gone were the disciplined heavy infantry formations of Caesar and Trajan. Instead, Narses commanded a mixed host of professional Byzantine troops, cavalry units trained in the Eastern style, and allied contingents of barbarian mercenaries who fought with their own weapons and tactics. His genius lay in coordinating these varied elements into a cohesive force. Against him, the Franks were fierce warriors, skilled with axe and spear, but less organized and often undisciplined when compared to the structured command of the Byzantines. They relied on sheer ferocity, charging en masse to overwhelm their enemies. The battlefield of Volturnus was shaped by the river and surrounding plains. Narses positioned his forces carefully, using the river to secure one flank and deploying his troops in a formation that allowed his cavalry to strike from the wings. He placed his infantry in the center, bolstered by archers and artillery units that could shower the enemy with missiles before the clash of steel. The Franks, confident in their numbers and brute strength, arrayed themselves for a direct assault, preparing to smash through the Byzantine center and scatter their foes. When the battle began, the Franks surged forward with tremendous energy, shouting war cries and striking their shields. They struck the Byzantine center with fury, hoping to break it before Narses' flanking maneuvers could come into play. For a moment, the Byzantine lines wavered under the pressure, the weight of the Frankish axes cutting through shields and armor. But Narses had anticipated this. His archers loosed a deadly rain of arrows, slowing the Frankish momentum, while his infantry held firm with grim determination. At the critical moment, Narses unleashed his cavalry from both wings. These horsemen, many of them skilled steppe riders or seasoned eastern cataphracts, charged into the exposed flanks of the Frankish mass. Suddenly the Franks found themselves hemmed in, pressed from the front and sides. Their formation collapsed into chaos as Byzantine swords and spears tore through their ranks. What had begun as a confident charge turned into a slaughter. Butulinus himself was killed in the fighting, and thousands of Franks lay dead on the field. The survivors broke and fled, pursued mercilessly by Byzantine cavalry. The Battle of Volturnus was a crushing victory for Narses and the Eastern Roman Empire. The Frankish threat was annihilated, and with it any major challenge to Byzantine authority in Italy. In the aftermath, Justinian issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 554, a decree that reorganized Italy under imperial administration. Rome and Ravenna once again acknowledged the authority of Constantinople, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the dream of restoring the Roman Empire in the West had been achieved. Yet this triumph was bittersweet. Italy was devastated, its cities depopulated, its farmlands ruined. The old Roman Senate still lingered, but it was a shadow of its former self. The aqueducts that once brought water to Rome had been cut during the wars, leaving the city diminished. The Byzantine administration was stretched thin, struggling to maintain order in a land scarred by 2 generations of conflict. Though the empire had won militarily, the human and economic cost meant that Italy would never again return to its former prosperity. In the broader view of history, the Battle of Volturnus represents the last great military effort to preserve the Roman idea in Italy. After Narses' victory, the empire held Italy for only a few more decades. In 568 AD, the Lombards, another Germanic people, invaded and carved out their own kingdom in the north, reducing Byzantine holdings to a few coastal cities and southern territories. Rome itself, while still revered as a spiritual and symbolic center, gradually slipped from imperial control. By the early Middle Ages, the dream of a united Roman Mediterranean world was gone, replaced by a patchwork of kingdoms and empires. Still, the legacy of Volturnus remained. It showed that even after nearly a century of decline, the Roman state could muster strength, discipline, and leadership to defeat powerful barbarian foes. Narses, often overshadowed by Belisarius, proved himself as one of the last great Roman generals, ensuring that Justinian's dream of reconquest was not in vain, at least for a time. The victory gave Constantinople a chance to reshape Italy, reassert the authority of Roman law, and preserve the connection between East and West, even if only briefly. The cultural and symbolic significance of this final clash cannot be overstated. The Roman people had seen their empire crumble in the West, their emperors replaced by barbarian kings, their once mighty armies shattered. Yet here, at Volturnus, they witnessed a revival, a last stand that restored the empire's banner over the heartland of Italy. The battle became a reminder that Rome, though battered, was not yet gone. It lived on in the East, and in the memories of those who still called themselves Romans. When one reflects on the scene at Volturnus, the images are striking. The river flowing silently beside the battlefield, the clash of steel echoing across the plains, the cries of men fighting for empire, survival, and glory. The Franks, bold and eager for conquest, met the disciplined might of an empire that refused to die. And in that moment, the world witnessed both the resilience and the fragility of Rome. The victory was glorious, but it was also the end of an era. Never again would Rome launch such a campaign to defend its legacy in the West. In many ways, Volturnus was the true, last stand, of Rome. While 476 AD is remembered as the fall, 554 AD was the final proof that the empire still lived, but only barely. It was the last time the Roman state marshaled its strength in Italy to defeat a major barbarian army. Afterward, the tide of history swept inexorably toward the Middle Ages, toward new kingdoms, new powers, and a world where the Roman eagle was but a memory. And so, the Battle of Volturnus stands not only as a military victory but as a poignant symbol of Rome's twilight. It was the moment when the empire, old and weary, still found the will to fight, to defy the darkness closing in around it. But it was also the moment when one could see that the empire's days were numbered, that its triumphs could no longer outlast the relentless march of time. Rome's final clash had been fought, and though it ended in victory, it also marked the beginning of the end. The legacy of Volturnus echoes through history as a story of resilience, of ambition, and of inevitable decline. It reminds us that empires, no matter how mighty, are mortal. Yet it also reminds us that Rome was not merely a state, but an idea, an identity that endured long after its armies marched for the last time. In 554 AD, on the banks of the Volturnus, Rome rose once more, fought bravely, and won. And in that final victory, even as the shadows lengthened, the eternal flame of the empire burned a little longer before fading into history. Fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD and survival of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD is often treated as the definitive end of Rome, when Romulus Augustulus, the last Western emperor, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic general who declared himself king of Italy. Yet the truth was more complex. While the western half of the empire collapsed under pressure from invasions, economic decline, and political weakness, the eastern half, based in Constantinople, remained strong and vibrant. This Eastern Roman Empire, later called Byzantium, still controlled the wealthy provinces of the Eastern Mediterranean, Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Balkans. Its armies, bureaucracy, and traditions carried on Roman governance in a form adapted to the times. Importantly, the emperors of Constantinople still claimed to be the true rulers of the entire Roman world, even if their authority was challenged in the West. For many people in the 6th century, Rome was not dead, it had simply shifted its center eastward. The survival of the Byzantine Empire meant that the idea of Rome continued to inspire loyalty and ambition, setting the stage for future emperors like Justinian to dream of reconquest. The legacy of 476 AD was thus both an end and a beginning. Emperor Justinian's ambitious plan to reconquer the lost western provinces. Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD, was one of the most visionary emperors of the Byzantine Empire. Brilliant, determined, and ruthless, he sought not only to govern effectively but also to restore Rome's ancient glory. His dream was to reclaim the lost western provinces, North Africa, Italy, and Spain, so that the Mediterranean might once again be a Roman lake. This grand vision was not merely romantic nostalgia. Justinian saw political and religious value in bringing back the Roman heartlands under imperial control. To him, Constantinople was the rightful heir of Rome, and its emperors had the divine duty to restore order to lands that had fallen into the hands of barbarian kings. Justinian devoted immense resources to this ambition, raising taxes heavily, reorganizing the legal code, and funding massive military campaigns. His generals Belisarius and Narses became legendary for their efforts in these reconquests. Under his rule, the Byzantines defeated the Vandals in North Africa, pushed into Spain, and embarked on the long and bloody Gothic Wars in Italy. Justinian's vision was costly and controversial, draining the empire's treasury, but it was also one of the last great attempts to revive the unified Roman world. The long and devastating Gothic Wars in Italy between Byzantines and Ostrogoths. The Gothic Wars, fought between 535 and 554 AD, were among the most destructive conflicts of the 6th century. The Ostrogoths, who had ruled Italy since the fall of the Western Empire, were a powerful and resilient people. Their king Theodoric the Great had established stability by blending Roman traditions with Gothic leadership, but after his death, instability weakened their hold. Justinian saw this as his opportunity to reclaim Italy, and he sent his general Belisarius to lead the invasion. What followed was nearly 2 decades of brutal warfare. The Byzantines initially won stunning victories, seizing Sicily, Naples, and even Rome. But the Ostrogoths refused to yield, rallying under strong kings like Totila. The war became a cycle of sieges, betrayals, and battles that devastated Italy's infrastructure. Aqueducts were cut, crops were burned, and whole cities were left in ruins. The Roman Senate, once a great political body, was reduced to near extinction. The population suffered terribly, with famine and disease spreading. What began as a war to restore Roman rule became an ordeal that left Italy broken. Yet it was also a war that revealed the determination of both sides, as neither Byzantines nor Ostrogoths would surrender easily. Role of Belisarius in the early phase of the reconquest. Belisarius, Justinian's greatest general, was central to the early successes of the Gothic War. Having already won fame in the east against the Persians and in North Africa against the Vandals, he was sent to Italy in 535 AD with a relatively small but disciplined force. His brilliance as a commander lay in his adaptability, cunning, and ability to inspire loyalty. With daring strategies, he captured key cities like Naples and Rome. When the Ostrogoths besieged Rome in 537 to 538, Belisarius defended the city with extraordinary resilience, holding out against overwhelming odds for over a year. His tactics, such as using mobile defenses and surprise counterattacks, frustrated the larger Gothic army. Despite his victories, Belisarius was often undermined by Justinian's suspicions and political rivalries at court. His resources were limited, and reinforcements were slow to arrive. By the early 540s, although he had achieved much, the war remained unresolved. Still, Belisarius' campaigns showed that a relatively small but well-led Byzantine army could defeat much larger forces. He became a symbol of Roman resilience and ingenuity, setting the stage for later generals like Narses to complete the reconquest. His efforts kept Italy within reach of imperial recovery during its darkest hours. Rise of Totila, Ostrogothic king, and his near reversal of Byzantine gains. Totila, who became king of the Ostrogoths in 541 AD, was one of the most dynamic leaders of the late Gothic wars. Young, charismatic, and militarily skilled, he rallied the Gothic people at a time when their fortunes seemed to be collapsing. Under his leadership, the Ostrogoths regained momentum, recapturing much of the territory Belisarius had won. Totila was not only a capable warrior but also a shrewd politician. He attempted to win the loyalty of Italians by presenting himself as a liberator from Byzantine taxation and harsh rule. He reduced rents for peasants, offered fair treatment, and portrayed himself as a restorer of justice. His military campaigns were bold and relentless. He retook Rome more than once, showing how fragile the Byzantine hold on Italy really was. Totila's use of mobility and surprise allowed his smaller forces to defeat larger Byzantine armies. For a time, it seemed as if Justinian's dream of reconquest would fail. Yet Totila also faced challenges, as internal divisions and the sheer exhaustion of Italy weakened Gothic resistance. Ultimately, despite his brilliance, he could not withstand the resources of the Byzantine Empire, and his death at Taginae in 552 marked the turning point of the war. Arrival of Narses as Byzantine commander in Italy. By 551 AD, with Italy still in turmoil, Justinian appointed Narses to take supreme command. Narses was an unlikely general, an elderly eunuch who had served for decades in the imperial court as a chamberlain and administrator. Yet beneath his unassuming appearance lay a sharp military mind. Unlike Belisarius, who was often starved of resources, Narses was given a massive army, drawn from across the empire and beyond. His forces included Byzantine regulars, Gothic defectors, Heruli, Lombards, and even Armenian contingents. Narses understood the value of organization, discipline, and combined arms tactics. He marched methodically through Italy, restoring Byzantine control step by step. In 552, he confronted Totila at Taginae and delivered a decisive victory, killing the Gothic king and breaking their power. Narses' command style was deliberate, patient, and ruthlessly effective. He understood how to use Italy's terrain, how to balance cavalry and infantry, and how to outthink his opponents. Though advanced in years, he became the empire's savior in the West. His leadership ensured that Justinian's vision of restoring Rome would not collapse, and it was under his command that the final showdown at Volturnus would take place. Victory at Taginae, 552 AD, and the death of Totila. The Battle of Taginae in 552 AD was a critical moment in the Gothic Wars. Totila, determined to halt the Byzantine advance, gathered his forces to challenge Narses in open battle. Narses, however, had carefully chosen his ground. He positioned his troops in a crescent formation, with infantry in the center and cavalry on the flanks, anticipating that the Goths would charge the middle. As expected, Totila's forces attacked the Byzantine center with ferocity. At that crucial moment, Narses unleashed his cavalry, which swept around the flanks and trapped the Gothic army in a deadly crossfire. The battle turned into a massacre. Totila himself was mortally wounded during the fight, and his death shattered Gothic morale. The loss at Taginae ended any realistic hope that the Ostrogoths could continue to resist effectively. Although some Gothic forces held out for a few more years, their cause was doomed. The battle demonstrated Narses' strategic genius and his ability to use diverse troops to maximum effect. More importantly, it cleared the way for Justinian's imperial restoration in Italy. Yet the victory also left the peninsula vulnerable to new invaders. For the Goths, fall opened the door to the Franks and Alemanni. New threat. Frankish and Alemanni invasions into Italy in 553 to 554 AD. No sooner had the Ostrogoths been crushed than a new danger emerged. The Franks, powerful rulers of Gaul, and their Alemanni allies saw Italy as ripe for conquest. Unlike the Ostrogoths, who had long established themselves as rulers within Roman traditions, the Franks were outsiders seeking plunder and expansion. Their kings, Theudebald and his generals Butulinus and Lutherus, led vast armies across the Alps into northern Italy. At first, they encountered little resistance, as the land was exhausted from years of Gothic wars. They marched south, devastating cities and countryside alike. The Franks were fierce warriors, known for their brutal axe-wielding infantry, and they cared little for preserving Roman institutions. Their arrival was catastrophic for the Italian people, who had already suffered famine, disease, and destruction. For Justinian, the invasion threatened to undo everything his empire had gained. If the Franks secured Italy, the reconquest would collapse. Unlike the Goths, who at least wanted to govern, the Franks seemed intent only on ravaging the land. Narses understood that this threat had to be crushed decisively if Rome's legacy in the West was to survive. The stage was thus set for the decisive confrontation at Volturnus in 554 AD. Division of Frankish forces under Butulinus and Lutherus. The invading Frankish army was vast, numbering tens of thousands, but it was not united under a single, disciplined command. Instead, it split into two major groups under the leadership of Butulinus and Lutherus. This division reflected both the opportunistic nature of the invasion and the lack of long-term strategic planning among the Franks. Lutherus led his forces on a devastating march through central Italy, plundering towns and seizing booty. However, he was struck by plague and withdrew north, eventually dying of disease along with many of his men. Butulinus, on the other hand, pressed deeper into the south, aiming to establish control over Campania. His army was more disciplined and remained a significant threat. For Narses, this division provided an opportunity. Rather than facing the entire Frankish host at once, he could confront Butulinus in isolation. Still, the army of Butulinus was formidable, consisting of hardened Frankish warriors and Alemanni allies eager for conquest. The splitting of forces highlighted the difference between the Byzantine and Frankish approaches. While the Franks were driven by short-term plunder, the Byzantines pursued a carefully planned reconquest. The division of leadership would ultimately contribute to their downfall at Volturnus. Narses' strategic deployment near the river Volturnus in 554 AD. The battlefield near the river Volturnus offered both challenges and opportunities. Narses, experienced and cautious, knew how to use terrain to his advantage. He positioned his army with the river securing one flank, reducing the chance of being outflanked by the numerically superior Franks. His forces were arranged in a broad line, infantry in the center, supported by archers and artillery, while cavalry stood ready on both wings. This deployment echoed the successful tactics he had used at Tagenae, ensuring flexibility and the potential for decisive flanking maneuvers. The Frankish army, in contrast, was eager for a frontal assault. They arranged their warriors in dense blocks, relying on the shock of their charge to overwhelm the Byzantine center. Narses' calm preparation contrasted with the reckless aggression of his opponents. He understood that discipline, patience, and timing could overcome brute strength. By carefully balancing his mixed army of Byzantines, mercenaries, and allied troops, he ensured that each unit played its part. His positioning at Volturnus was not just military genius, it was the culmination of decades of Roman tactical evolution, combining classical strategy with the realities of 6th century warfare. The battle tactics. Frankish direct assault versus Byzantine disciplined defense and cavalry flanking. When the battle began, the Frankish warriors charged with their customary ferocity. Shouting war cries and wielding axes, they rushed directly at the Byzantine center. Their tactic was simple but terrifying. Overwhelm the enemy with sheer force and break through the lines before discipline and strategy could take effect. At first, their assault seemed unstoppable. The Byzantine infantry, though well trained, struggled under the weight of the attack. Shields splintered, formations wavered, and casualties mounted. But Narses had anticipated this. Behind the infantry, his archers unleashed volleys of arrows, cutting down Frankish warriors and disrupting their momentum. The center held just long enough for Narses to spring his trap. On both wings, his cavalry thundered forward. These were not ordinary horsemen but heavily armed cataphracts and skilled mercenary riders, trained to strike with precision. They swept into the exposed flanks of the Frankish horde, turning the battle into chaos. Surrounded, the Franks could no longer fight as a unified mass. Panic spread as discipline collapsed. What had begun as a confident charge devolved into desperate survival. The combination of disciplined defense, missile fire, and devastating cavalry attacks demonstrated the superiority of Byzantine tactical organization over raw barbarian fury. Death of Butulinus and the catastrophic defeat of the Frankish army. As the battle raged at Volturnus, the tide turned decisively against the Franks. Their initial charge had failed, their flanks were collapsing, and Byzantine cavalry cut down fleeing warriors. In the chaos, their leader Butulinus was killed, either in direct combat or struck down during the rout. His death sealed the fate of the Frankish army. Leaderless, surrounded, and exhausted, the Frankish warriors fell in droves. Contemporary accounts describe the battlefield as a slaughter, with tens of thousands of Franks and Alemanni lying dead. Few escaped, and those who did carried tales of disaster back north. The destruction of Butulinus' army eliminated the Frankish threat in Italy almost overnight. Narses' victory was so complete that it re-established Byzantine dominance in the region, bringing an end to 2 decades of warfare. The catastrophic defeat of the Franks also discouraged further large-scale invasions for a time, as the power of the Eastern Roman military was once again demonstrated. Yet the human cost was staggering. Italy, already ruined by the Gothic Wars, now saw another wave of bloodshed. The death of Butulinus was not just the fall of a leader but the end of Frankish ambitions in Italy. Aftermath. Justinian's pragmatic sanction of 554 re-establishing imperial rule in Italy. In the wake of Volturnus, Justinian seized the opportunity to consolidate his authority over Italy. He issued the pragmatic sanction of 554, a decree that reorganized Italy's governance and reaffirmed it as part of the Roman Empire. The decree restored the authority of Roman law, confirmed the rights of landowners, and attempted to stabilize the devastated peninsula. Justinian aimed not only to secure political control but also to revive the image of a restored Roman world. With Ravenna as the administrative center and Rome as a symbolic capital, Italy was once again bound to Constantinople. The pragmatic sanction also sought to repair the relationship between the Byzantine government and the Italian population, who had grown weary of war and taxation. By emphasizing justice, legal stability, and continuity with Roman tradition, Justinian hoped to win back hearts and minds. Yet the challenge was enormous. The land was depopulated, cities lay in ruins, and economic recovery was uncertain. Still, for a moment, it seemed as though the empire had triumphed, restoring its heartland to the fold. The pragmatic sanction was both a celebration of victory and an attempt to heal a land scarred by decades of conflict. Consequences. Devastation of Italy despite Byzantine victory. Although the Byzantines had achieved victory, the consequences for Italy were grim. Decades of war had reduced the once prosperous peninsula to ruin. Agricultural production collapsed as fields lay abandoned and irrigation systems fell into disrepair. Cities that had flourished under the Roman Empire were depopulated or destroyed. Rome itself, though recaptured and celebrated as a symbol, was a shadow of its former glory, its population dwindling and its infrastructure shattered. The Senate, once a central institution of governance, was nearly extinct. The aqueducts that had sustained the city had been cut during sieges, leaving Rome dependent on wells and rainwater. Famine and plague spread in the wake of armies, further reducing the population. Economically, Italy could no longer support the weight of imperial taxation or military garrisons. The pragmatic sanction sought to stabilize governance, but the material resources of the land were gone. For the Italians, the Byzantine victory did not feel like liberation but another phase of suffering. The devastation ensured that even though the empire regained Italy, it could never fully restore it to its former prosperity. Victory at Volturnus was thus bittersweet, militarily glorious, but economically and socially catastrophic. The Battle of Volturnus is the true, last stand, of Rome in the West. In the grand arc of history, The Battle of Volturnus in 554 AD stands as the last great effort of the Roman Empire to assert its authority in the West. While the fall of 476 AD marked the end of the Western emperors, Volturnus symbolized Rome's final attempt to rise again in its ancient heartland. Narses' victory was not only a military triumph but also a symbolic one. It proved that Rome's legacy still had teeth, that the empire could still crush barbarian invaders with discipline, strategy, and resilience. Yet it was also a farewell. After Volturnus, no Roman army would ever again fight such a decisive battle for the control of Italy. Within a generation, the Lombards would invade, and Byzantine control would shrink to fragments.